I drove to my son's restaurant that morning to drop off the wine order he'd forgotten to place, the one for Saturday's anniversary dinner. Through the kitchen's swinging door, I heard my daughter-in-law's voice, sharp with something I'd never heard from her before: fear. "Please, David." I told the vendor I'd have the check by Friday. And then I heard him, my son, the boy I'd raised to shake hands firmly and look people in the eye, say, "You'll have it when I say you'll have it. You don't run this place. You're a name on a lease I let you keep." I looked through the gap in the door and saw her on her knees, not out of submission, but because she'd dropped to pick up a stack of papers he'd swept off the desk, and he was standing over her, close, one hand braced on the desk like a wall closing in. I did not go in. I stood in that narrow hallway between the walk-in cooler and the prep station, and something in my chest went very still and very cold. This is what happened after. And if you've made it this far, something already told you this one matters. Before I go further, tell me where you're watching from. Son, daughter, mother, father, whoever you are to somebody, drop it below. I want to know who's still with me tonight. A quick note. Some details here have been adjusted for the people involved. If the shape of it feels familiar, that's not an accident of memory. It's the shape betrayal always takes. Everything else, carry it with you. My name is Walter Kessler, and I spent 41 years building furniture. Not selling it, building it, then selling it, then owning 3 factories that built it for other people to sell. I started in my father-in-law's garage in Grand Rapids with a table saw and a debt I didn't tell my late wife, Ruth, about until our 2nd anniversary. I built oak dining tables by hand until my hands couldn't tell the difference between wood grain and my own skin anymore. I buried Ruth 11 years ago. I buried a business partner who embezzled from me and then had the nerve to die owing me money before I could take him to court. I know what it costs to build something real, and I know what it looks like when someone is standing inside your life pretending to help you carry it while they're quietly setting it on fire. I felt something shift the moment I stepped through the back door of Marlowe's, the restaurant my son David had begged me to help him open 6 years ago. It was a Thursday afternoon in late September, and I'd driven myself, because I always drive myself. My driver, Samuel, offered, and I told him I wanted the quiet. 40 minutes down I-96 with the windows cracked, thinking about nothing heavier than whether the anniversary dinner should have the 19 Cabernet or the 21. Elena would know. She always knew things like that. She'd built the wine program at Marlowe's from nothing, the same way she'd built the whole front-of-house operation, the reservation system, the staff training, the little handwritten notes she left for regulars on their birthdays. That restaurant had her fingerprints on every surface, though David's name was the one on the liquor license. The kitchen door was propped, the way it always was during the afternoon lull before dinner service, and I could hear the low hum of the walk-in cooler, and, underneath it, voices. I wasn't trying to listen. I want to be honest about that, because honesty is the only thing I have left that's worth anything. I wasn't trying to listen. I was carrying a case of wine toward the office, and the voices stopped me the way a hand on your shoulder stops you. Not because you chose it, but because your body decided, before your mind caught up. "Shut your mouth and pick that up," David said. His voice was low, controlled, the kind of controlled that scares you more than shouting because it means the person has rehearsed this. "You don't get to talk to me about vendors. You don't get to talk to me about anything until I say you can." Elena said something I couldn't hear. Her voice had gone thin, the way a voice goes when a person is trying very hard to keep it from breaking in front of someone who wants to see it break. "I don't care what the contract says," David said. "I don't care what your name is on. If you say one word to my father about this, I will make sure you leave this restaurant with nothing but the clothes on your back and a story nobody will believe. Because everybody in this town believes David Kessler before they believe some woman from Cleveland who married up. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" I stood in that hallway with a case of wine in my arms, and 38 years of raising that boy collapsing in on itself like a building coming down floor by floor. I had watched David give a speech at the Rotary Club dinner 4 months ago, watched him talk about legacy and family values with his hand on my shoulder, and I had felt the kind of pride that embarrasses me now, remembering it. He was not using that same voice in the office in front of me. He was using a voice I didn't recognize, and it terrified me more than if I had recognized it, because it meant this wasn't new. This was practiced. I stood there in the gap between the walk-in and the office door, and I did not move. Everything in me, 41 years of building things with my hands, of solving problems by fixing them directly, told me to set that wine down and push through that door. I am not a small man. I dug ditches before I owned factories. There are things that get put into you when you spend your 20s doing physical work that never quite leave, even at 63. I felt all of it pulling at me. Push the door. Say his name. Put myself between my son and that woman. I didn't do it. Not because I was afraid of David, because some cold, patient part of me understood, standing there with my hand 3 inches from that door handle, that walking in would end exactly one thing, this conversation, and leave everything else precisely as it had been. Elena would say she was fine. David would say it was nothing, a disagreement about vendors, business stress, and I would go home telling myself I'd misheard the tone of it. Nothing would change except that they would both know I'd been standing there. I set the wine case down as quietly as I could and backed away. One step, then another, until I reached the swinging door to the dining room. And I went out through the front instead, past the empty tables with their folded napkins waiting for Thursday dinner service. I sat in my truck in the parking lot for what felt like a long time before I looked at the dashboard clock and saw it had been 14 minutes. I know because I watched that clock the entire time without seeing it. Then I called Samuel. "I need you at my house tonight," I said. "Not tomorrow. Tonight." Samuel Ortiz has worked for me for 26 years, first as a floor supervisor at the Kalamazoo plant, then, after an incident with a supplier who tried to steal patent designs, as something closer to what people in movies call a fixer, though he'd never used that word himself. He's quiet, methodical, and he has never once asked me why when I use a certain tone of voice. "I'm already getting my keys," he said. I sat in that truck and stared through the windshield at the brick wall of the strip mall across the street, and I thought about the fact that my son had just threatened his wife in her own restaurant, with the same casual fluency of a man who had said those words before, more than once, and I hadn't seen it, because I hadn't been looking. I had a 40th wedding anniversary party to plan for the two of them at the country club in 3 weeks. I did not leave the parking lot immediately. That's the part I left out later, when I told Samuel the story, when I told my attorney the story. I told them I'd walked straight to my truck. The truth is, I stood in that hallway another 6 minutes after David finished with Elena, because something colder than anger kept my feet where they were. David had stopped standing over Elena and started pacing, the way he paced when he thought out loud, and his voice had shifted from that controlled quiet into something almost relaxed, almost pleased with himself. "You think I don't have a plan for when the old man finds out?" he said. I don't know if he was still talking to Elena or to himself by then. It didn't matter. I've been moving numbers for 3 years, small enough nobody flags it. The equipment leases are in Dad's name because he insisted on co-signing like some kind of favor, and when the leases default, and they will default, I've already stopped paying 2 of them. Every dollar comes back on him. Not me. Him. And by the time anyone untangles it, I'll have moved the real money somewhere he'll never find it, and that old fool will be too busy trying to save his own credit to worry about who took it from him. I stood with my back against the cold wall beside that door and did not breathe. Equipment leases. I had co-signed 4 of them over the past 3 years, exactly as he'd said, because he told me the bank required a family guarantor for a business still building its credit history, and I had signed without reading past the first page because I trusted my son the way you trust gravity, without checking whether it was still holding. I heard Elena make a sound then, not a word, something smaller and sharper than a word, the sound a person makes when something lands somewhere they thought was already broken as far as it could go. I'd heard enough. I walked back through the dining room, out the front doors, and sat in my truck with my hand flat against the steering wheel, breathing the way I taught myself to breathe on the factory floor when a machine jammed, and my temper wanted to solve it before my judgment did. I called Samuel back before he'd even left his driveway. "Change of plans," I said. "I need everything we have on the equipment leases for Marlowe's, tonight, and I need you to find out everything you can about what David's been doing with restaurant funds for the last 3 years. There was a pause on the line. "And, Walter, how bad?" I watched a city bus pull away from the curb across the street, the driver not looking up, doing the same route he'd done 10,000 times before, the world around him no longer registering as anything but motion. "Bad enough," I said. "And I need you to find out something else, quietly. I need to know if Elena's safe tonight. and I need to know it without her knowing we're asking. The anniversary party, 40 years married, 300 guests. Booked at the Belvedere Country Club 8 weeks ago because I'd insisted it was time to celebrate. Something sat in my calendar like an ordinary thing. It was no longer ordinary. I thought about Elena upstairs in that office, straightening whatever David had knocked to the floor, arranging her face back into the expression she'd wear when she walked out to greet the dinner staff. I thought about my granddaughter, Sophie, 7 years old, who called me every Sunday to tell me about her hamster, Biscuit, in exhaustive scientific detail, who had no idea her father spoke to her mother the way I'd just heard him speak. By the time I pulled out of that parking lot, I had decided 3 things. I would see Elena alone, before she had the chance to rebuild whatever wall she used to survive that marriage. I would get Samuel into those equipment lease records before David could touch them. And the anniversary party, which had been nothing but a celebration 2 hours earlier, was going to become something else entirely. I didn't know yet exactly what, but I had a room, a date, 300 witnesses, and a son who had just told me everything I needed to know while assuming no one was listening. Samuel came to my house at 9 that night with a folder an inch thick, and what was inside it took the last of the warmth out of that room. 4 equipment leases, all co-signed by me, 3 of them already 2 payments behind, structured through a leasing company David had chosen himself, one I'd never bothered to research because he'd told me his business partner recommended them. There was no business partner. There was a shell company registered in Delaware, with David's name buried 3 layers down in the ownership documents. The same pattern Samuel had seen once before, years ago, in a case that had nothing to do with my family and everything to do with the kind of people who make careers out of hollowing out other people's trust. "There's something else," Samuel said, and he had that particular stillness in his voice that meant he didn't want to say the next part. "The restaurant's books show consistent monthly withdrawals to account under a name I don't recognize. Not David's name. A woman named Priya Anand." I sat with that for a long moment. Who is she? I don't know yet. But the withdrawals started around the same time the lease defaults did. And Walter, she's not local. The account's based in Scottsdale, Arizona. I thought about the pattern of it. The architecture David had built without knowing that building it required leaving footprints. And I thought about Elena on her knees, on that office floor with papers scattered around her. And I understood, sitting at my own kitchen table at 9:40 at night, that there were at least 2 stories running through my son's life, and neither of them was the one he'd been telling at Rotary Club dinners. The next morning I called my attorney, a sharp, unflappable woman named Denise Fairweather who had handled my business affairs for 15 years and had never once flinched at anything I'd brought her, including the year my former partner tried to forge my signature on a buyout agreement. "I need to see Elena alone," I told her, "and I need you to tell me, off the record, what it would take for a woman in her position to protect herself, financially and otherwise, from a husband who's already threatened her." Denise didn't ask why immediately, which told me she'd already guessed something close to it. "Does she know you know?" "Not yet." "Then be careful how you approach her, Walter. If she's protecting herself in a marriage like that, she's already calculating every conversation for what it might cost her. If you come in too fast, you might spook her into silence instead of trust." I found Elena 2 days later at the small coffee shop 3 blocks from the restaurant, the one she went to on her rare mornings off, and I sat down across from her without any of the speech I'd rehearsed on the drive over. "I was in the hallway Thursday afternoon," I said. "By the walk-in. I heard David. All of it." Her face did something I will remember for the rest of my life, a flicker of pure terror before she caught it and folded it away. The reflex of someone who has trained her own face to survive scrutiny. "Walter, it wasn't." "Don't," I said, gently as I could manage. "Don't do that for me. Not right now. I'm not here to make you say it was fine. I'm here because I've spent 6 years watching my son and thinking I understood him, and I understood nothing. I need you to tell me how long." She was quiet long enough that I thought she might get up and leave. Then she said, 3 years, since right after Sophie turned 4. Her hands were wrapped around a coffee cup she wasn't drinking. It started small. Comments about money, about how the restaurant only worked because of his name, his credit, even though I built the whole operation from a folding table and a phone. Then it got worse when I started asking questions about where certain payments were going. The equipment leases, I said. She looked up sharply. You know about those. I co-signed them. I've been paying for my son's plan to bankrupt me without knowing it for 3 years, Elena. I need you to tell me what you know, and I need you to understand that whatever happens next, you and Sophie are not going to be collateral damage in it. It took another 40 minutes, and 2 more coffees neither of us drank, but she told me. She had a folder of her own, kept on a cloud account under a name that wasn't hers, documenting the threats, the financial control, 2 separate incidents where David had grabbed her hard enough to leave marks she'd covered with makeup and long sleeves for a week each time. She had been building her case in silence for a year, terrified that if she moved too soon, he'd make good on his threat to take Sophie and paint her as an unfit, unstable mother to every judge and every friend they shared. There's something else, she said, and her voice dropped even further. I don't know how to prove this, and I don't know if it matters to you, but I think David's seeing someone. He's been going to Scottsdale for what he calls supplier meetings, almost every month for the last year. He never used to travel that much. I told her about Priya Anand and the withdrawals, and I watched something complicated move across her face, not jealousy, I don't think, but something closer to a strange, bitter relief. The relief of a person who has spent years being told she was imagining things, finally handed proof that she wasn't. Samuel found Priya Anand within 4 days. She was 34, ran a boutique event planning business out of Scottsdale, and had been in what she believed was a serious, exclusive relationship with a divorced restaurant owner from Michigan for the past 14 months. David had told her he was divorced. He had told her his ex-wife had taken him for everything in the settlement, which was why he needed to keep his finances quiet for a while, why he could never quite commit to a date to move her out to Michigan the way he kept promising. He had, according to the records Samuel pulled, been systematically draining Marlowe's operating accounts to fund an apartment lease in Scottsdale, a leased BMW in Priya's name that he made the payments on, and a ring, an actual engagement ring, purchased 8 months ago that Priya was wearing when Samuel's contact photographed her at a farmer's market, laughing at something on her phone, entirely unaware that the man she believed was her fiancé had a wife and a 7-year-old daughter, 4 states away. 2 people, each convinced they were the one being deceived by circumstance rather than by design. Priya believed she was patiently waiting out a bitter divorce settlement. Elena believed she was documenting abuse in isolation, with no idea her husband's second life had a name and a face and a Scottsdale zip code. David was the only person who knew the whole shape of what he'd built, and he had built it assuming neither woman would ever have a reason to compare notes. Does Priya have any idea he's married? I asked Samuel. None. Her social media is public. She posts about the relationship openly. Vacations, the ring, tags a restaurant in Scottsdale called the Copper Fox, where they apparently go every visit. She has no reason to hide anything, because as far as she knows, there's nothing to hide. I thought about that for a long time, sitting in my study with Priya Anand's photograph on the desk in front of me, a woman with an open, easy smile who had done nothing wrong except trust the wrong man's version of events. I am not proud of what I did next, and I have thought about whether to leave it out of this story entirely. But I promised myself I would tell this the way it happened, not the way that makes me look wise. I want her to know, I said, not from us directly, but I want her to know before the anniversary party, and I want her to know in a way that David can't spin into a lie afterward. Samuel looked at me for a long moment. That's not really my area, Walter. I know. I don't want to know how you do it. I'm asking if it's possible. Anything's possible, he said. I just want to be clear that whatever happens after that message reaches her is between her and David. I'm not going to insert myself into it, beyond making sure the truth arrives intact. That's all I want, I said. The truth, arriving intact. Denise filed a temporary protective order for Elena on a Tuesday morning, quietly, before David had any idea the equipment lease investigation had gone further than a conversation about late payments. That same afternoon, an anonymous message reached Priya Anand's private email, 4 sentences, no signature, laying out David's real last name, his real marital status, his daughter's name, and a public record link to the Marlowe's liquor license with his legal name on it. Samuel told me later without elaborating on how he knew that Priya had called the number on David's phone contract 17 times within an hour of reading it. David was at the restaurant when his phone started ringing with calls he didn't recognize from an Arizona number over and over, and then a text arrived that Samuel's contact glimpsed over his shoulder in the parking lot before he stormed inside 4 words. All it said, "I know everything, David. I was at my house that evening, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee I wasn't drinking, when Samuel called." "He's not answering Priya's calls," Samuel said. "But here's the thing, Walter. She's not just angry. She bought a plane ticket 40 minutes ago. She lands in Grand Rapids at 6:40 tomorrow morning." I sat with the phone against my ear and thought about a woman flying 4 states to confront a man who had spent 14 months building an entire fictional life for her benefit. And I thought about Elena upstairs in her own house that same night, finally sleeping without flinching at every sound in the hallway for the first time in 3 years, because the protective order meant David had been served and was staying, under his lawyer's advice, at a hotel until the hearing. "Does David know she's coming?" I asked. "No indication of it. He's been drinking since about 4 this afternoon, from what I'm told, and making calls to a criminal defense attorney in Grand Rapids. I think the lease investigation has reached him faster than we expected." "How?" "Someone at the bank flagged the defaults for review after Denise's office made an inquiry into the guarantor liability. It reached David's ears within a day. He knows something's coming. He doesn't know everything that's coming." I thought about the anniversary party, still sitting on the calendar 3 weeks out, 300 guests. A room booked, because I'd wanted, 8 weeks earlier, to celebrate 40 years of a marriage that had never actually been what any of us thought it was. I made a decision sitting at that table that I have turned over in my mind many times since, wondering if it was mercy or cruelty, and I still don't fully know the answer. "Cancel nothing," I said. "The party stays on the calendar, but it isn't going to be what David thinks it's going to be." The morning Priya Anand landed in Grand Rapids, she took a rideshare directly to Marlowe's, arriving at 11, during the lunch lull, wearing the ring David had given her, carrying a folder of her own photographs, texts, the lease agreement on the Scottsdale apartment with David's signature on it. Samuel had a contact seated at the bar, who described what happened next in careful, unembellished detail, because I asked him to give it to me exactly as it occurred, no drama added. David came out from the office when the hostess told him a woman was asking for him by name, and according to the account, his face went through 3 distinct stages in about 4 seconds: confusion, recognition, and then something that could only be described as the look of a man watching 2 separate buildings he'd constructed years apart collapse into each other in real time. Elena was not there that day. She was with Denise, finalizing the protective order paperwork. But 3 servers and 2 line cooks watched a woman none of them recognized set a folder of photographs on the host stand and asked David, in a voice that carried across the mostly empty dining room, whether he wanted to explain the ring on her finger to his wife, or whether she should just wait for the wife to arrive for the lunch shift like she apparently did every Thursday. He did not have an answer that satisfied anyone in that room. He asked her to lower her voice. She did not lower her voice. Within 10 minutes, according to Samuel's contact, half the kitchen staff had gathered near the pass, watching a scene that would be the subject of restaurant industry gossip in that town for months, and David Kessler, who had built his entire identity on being the man who never lost control of a room, lost control of that one completely. The protective order hearing took place 11 days later. Denise had assembled everything by then: Elena's documentation, the financial records showing the deliberate lease defaults engineered to transfer liability onto me, bank statements tracing 3 years of withdrawals to the Scottsdale accounts, and a growing pile of testimony, because once one crack appeared in David's carefully maintained surface, other things started coming loose. A former Marlowe's bookkeeper, fired 18 months earlier under circumstances she'd always found suspicious, came forward on her own after hearing rumors, with records she'd quietly copied before she left, records showing David had been falsifying vendor invoices to skim cash for over 2 years, well before the Scottsdale relationship even began. I sat in the gallery of that courtroom in a gray suit I'd worn to Ruth's funeral 11 years earlier, and I watched my son sit at a table across the room from a woman he had promised, at our own wedding, my wedding, to protect and honor, as his father had tried to protect and honor her mother-in-law before her. The judge, a measured woman named Judge Alvarez, who had clearly presided over enough of these hearings to no longer be surprised by any of it, read through the evidence with the flat, careful attention of someone weighing consequences that would outlast the hearing itself. The court finds, she said, that the pattern of documented threats, financial coercion, and physical intimidation supports the petitioner's request for a permanent protective order, effective immediately. She looked at David over her reading glasses. Full physical custody of the minor child is awarded to the petitioner, Elena Kessler. Visitation for the respondent will be supervised only, pending completion of a court-mandated intervention program, and reviewed no sooner than 12 months from today. She set her papers down. With respect to the business entity known as Marlowe's, the court will address financial restitution separately, given the ongoing criminal referral related to fraudulent invoicing and loan guarantee liability. It took perhaps 90 seconds. Everything Elena had documented alone in silence for a year. Everything Samuel and Denise and I had assembled in 3 weeks once we finally knew where to look, became permanent and real in 90 seconds, in a courtroom on the 4th floor of the Kent County Courthouse. David was charged separately in criminal court 6 weeks later on counts related to financial fraud and falsified business records. His attorney negotiated a plea rather than risk a trial with a bookkeeper, a forensic accountant, and his own recorded threats working against him. He received 4 years, with the possibility of an earlier release contingent on restitution and program completion. The equipment leases were restructured, and the liability against me was reduced substantially once the fraudulent origin of the defaults was established in the plea agreement. Priya Anand, as far as Samuel could determine, flew home to Scottsdale 2 days after the confrontation at the restaurant, and, understandably, never spoke to any of us again. I hope she's all right. I think about her more than I expected to. The restaurant stayed open. Elena runs it now, under her own name on the license, with a small business loan co-signed by no one but herself, because she insisted, when I offered, that she needed to know she could build it without anyone's name propping hers up. On a Saturday in late October, I drove out to the lake house I still keep from the years Ruth and I used to take Sophie there as a baby. Elena and Sophie were on the dock when I arrived. Sophie was trying to teach Biscuit, the hamster, to sit inside a small cardboard boat she'd built, explaining to the hamster at some length why floating was a skill worth learning. The hamster was not cooperating, and Sophie was not deterred. Elena sat on the edge of the dock with a mug of tea in both hands, watching her daughter with the particular stillness of a person who has finally stopped waiting for something bad to happen. I sat down beside her. We didn't talk about the courthouse, or the sentencing, or Priya Anand, or any of the 11 weeks that had brought us there. We watched Sophie argue gently with a hamster about buoyancy, and after a while the hamster, apparently satisfied, sat still long enough for the little boat to drift a few feet from the dock before Sophie scooped it back to safety with the seriousness of a rescue operation. She made a sound that was entirely 7 years old and entirely uncomplicated and entirely enough. Elena leaned her shoulder against mine. "She's going to be okay," she said. "Yes," I said. "She is." The lake moved in its slow October rhythm below the dock. The light held on gold a little longer than it had in September. I've thought for a long time about what to say here. At the end of this, I am not a wise man. I'm a man who spent 41 years building tables and factories and never once thought to check whether the foundation of my own son's character had rotted underneath the polish. I trusted the version of him he performed at Rotary dinners over the pattern I could have seen if I'd been paying attention years earlier. Don't be like me. Pay attention early. The people who mean to take from you rarely announce it with a shout. They arrive through the door you already opened for them, and they study the architecture of your trust before they use it against you. I believe some of us get placed exactly where we're needed, at exactly the moment we're needed there. Elena, Samuel, Denise, even a woman in Scottsdale I never met, and hurt more than I meant to. None of what happened in those 11 weeks was something I could have carried alone, and I don't believe I was meant to. My own belief, for whatever it's worth after 63 years of getting some of it wrong, is this. Family isn't the name on the paperwork. It's whoever stays, whoever tells you the truth even when it costs them, and whoever shows up when showing up is expensive. These aren't the stories we tell at holiday dinners. because they're too heavy and sit too close to the bone. But a story about getting even without a lesson at the end of it is just noise, and I've had enough noise in my life to know the difference. The only part worth keeping is what you carry forward. If any part of this stayed with you, tell me which moment hit hardest. I read every one of them. And if this is the kind of story that means something to you, stay close, because there's always another one waiting to be told.